Thumbs up. The mic is on. This room is packed. I'm used to like 30 people in a room, for these sessions. So they said that attendance this year is like 7,000 or 7,500 people, and that is amazing. So thank you all for joining us today for what probably feels like the 200th panel discussion on AI at this year's conference. I just made that number up, like GPT. I tend to hallucinate with my facts. But it certainly feels that way, doesn't it? I mean, I think AI is kind of having its, everything, everywhere, all at once moment. And a lot of companies are announcing their new AI tutors and features these days. And it's a really exciting time, I think, to have this kind of 100 flowers blooming moment. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tony Wan, and I'm the head of platform at Reach Capital. We are an early stage venture capital firm focused on education and the future of work. We just announced our newest fund, and we have a little carve-out fund for early stage pre-seed investments for AI edtech startups. So if you're building, we'd love to talk to you afterwards. I'm delighted for this discussion on the intersection of AI and accessibility and an opportunity. And it's a pleasure to be joined by some of the movers and shakers in this space, starting with Andrew Su. He's the co-founder and CTO of Speak. Next after him is Satya Nitta. He is the co-founder and CEO of Merlyn Mind. Nancy Lee is the Chief Product Officer of BrightAI. And Kristina Ishmael is next to me. She is the Deputy Director of the United States Department of Education's Office of Educational Technology. I like
so many syllables.
I like that. So we'll hear a little bit more about what they're building, but I think first, when I think about this generation of AI and accessibility, I think one of the things that's most exciting is just about lowering the barriers to building and creating software. One of the first things that I did when I learned that students were using GPT was I took all the articles that I used to write for EdSurge, my last job, and I fed it into GPT. And what I essentially created was a fake news bot that sounded like me. And the utility of that is very dubious and maybe dangerous, but to see it be possible with such few steps and with no programming background was really cool, and it was a really cool reflection tool for me as a writer. So before we kind of get into a little bit of what you're doing, I'm just curious, what are some of the coolest things? What's the coolest thing that you've seen a teacher or a student or a non-developer build with AI or GPT tools these days? Maybe I'll start with the end with Andrew.
Yeah, sure. So I am an entrepreneur building in Silicon Valley using generative AI. So it's very much at the very center of the sort of entire wave. So it's been actually so crazy just seeing, hundreds, probably thousands of engineers in the city go to these hackathons every single weekend and try to build stuff on top of the ChatGPT API, the GPT-4 API, all the new stuff coming out. It's really hard to pick specific projects. I think for me, one of the most exciting trends, maybe that's not specific to a product, is this idea of language model chaining. I don't know how many of you have heard of that, but it's essentially giving the language model, like GPT-4, a task, and then there's some sort of output. And then you feed that output as an input into another task. And you can do that an arbitrary number of times. And it kind of starts to feel like, hey, maybe these are the very basic building blocks of some sort of more general intelligence system, right? Or education system or assessment system. So there's, we're in language learning, but even outside of language learning, there's people teaching science and math this way, reading, writing, child literacy. It's a super unprecedented rate of change that is kind of anxiety-inducing and awe-inspiring at the same time.
Great. Let's just go down to Satya.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, so I agree with Andrew. It's an incredible time to be in AI. So we've been in the space as Merlyn Mind as a company for 5 years, and I've been working in AI for about 15 years with IBM Watson before Merlyn Mind. And I have not seen the kind of unprecedented adoption of AI that we've seen this year, right? In the 15 odd years that we've been in the space. It's absolutely incredible. And so some of the most exciting things we've seen with teachers and students using AI, I'll pick up on what Andrew said with language model chaining. The idea that you can have a conversation with a system in a classroom, right? And the system's then kind of participating in a way. It's not quite there, but it's nearly there. And that's kind of what we're working on at Merlyn Mind, to bring voice-based conversational abilities like the Star Trek computer into a classroom, that you not only ask questions and right, not just like factoid questions, but very complex and analogical questioning, right? And then having the model turn back and say, and turn the questions back to the students and say, what are some things you would do, right? What are some activities you could do? These are kinds of things that we're helping teachers and students do with conversational AI in classrooms, right? So broadly, we think this is actually quite revolutionary. The fact that you can have a very unconstrained conversation with a system. And I do remember a time in AI back in the 2010s when having a system understand a student response in natural language and score it or respond intelligently back to it was really difficult. Having a system summarize things was really difficult. So the kinds of possibilities that exist today are only limited by our imagination. And one additional thing that I'll pick up on, right? Andrew did mention, people are doing some interesting things with math and science. The idea that you can use plugins with ChatGPT or with language models broadly, right? Whether ChatGPT will ultimately be the model that we win in education or not is debatable, right? We think there will be other purpose-built models for education. But the idea that you can use plugins to perform actions, which are things like going to Desmos and having it solve an equation and plot it all through a voice command. You can't do that today with ChatGPT, but you should be able to do that very shortly in the next few months, right? And there are some people who are working with us and who are also independently experimenting, who are trying out these capabilities. And so by next year, you'll see dramatically changed classrooms everywhere, with people having conversations with AI, AI performing actions, AI having a sense of memory about previous interactions and responding contextually, right? So all these things will all come together. They're not quite there, but this is exactly what's about to happen, right?
Great. Nancy?
So, I work in this AI company where we build like AI co-pilots for the 2 billion frontline workforce. So I guess among this crew, I represent the, hey, like for the blue collar jobs, like what's going to happen there. We are building like some of these like kind of autonomous AI systems to go in and be able to address some of these really hard physical labor jobs, right? Like from inspecting the sewage pipelines, literally poop water pipes. Like, the customer like last year hired 500 people, retained 70, and this is all like the new Gen Z workforce coming in. They're like, the average time they go into the job is 3 to 6 months, because they're like, why do I have to do that job? And then you ask like, where do they go? They go, I'd rather like just drive an Uber or go do the Instacart or like be an influencer online or like, whatever other things where I can live anywhere. I don't have to, be leaving home for like 3 months, driving a truck around the US to inspect sewage pipes, right? So there's this huge gap that's raising. If imagine if you're the CEO of these companies in the infrastructure services that actually are really like mission critical, from the water that we drink to the air that we breathe to all these like really kind of mission critical sectors. And literally there's every 2 job opening, there's only 1 person who can do that job right now. And that whole gap, I think, creates this opportunity for AI. Not in a way, I had this conversation. It's like, oh, it's so scary. Like AI is going to replace humans' jobs, like especially blue-collar jobs. But it's not that. It's like the new generation of the workforce don't want to do the job where like their dad or grandfather, where like, oh, I have to. Everywhere we went, it's like, oh, the water plant. Like, oh, I've worked at the exact same water plant for 30 years. Like, how do you know which knob to tweak? And it's like a big plant, right? Like, what all the things. He's like, oh, I just walk around the thing every day, and I, kind of have a feeling about it. Like, that's how it's done today. That's how all of our main critical infrastructure is managed today. And then the person coming in with 1 year experience, the apprentice, like I don't want to be there for 20 years. Then we're basically leveraging, and each of these industries have these documented knowledge, right? The HVAC have this big of a book is orange. The whole industry knows about it. We can feed that knowledge into the AI, to ChatGPT, and then like the person coming on the job the first day. They can have that very easy Q&A. At the same time, we're automating and unlocking all that system and all the data that's stuck in this physical world to provide them the AI recommendations. So like, hey, the 30-year knowledge now is digitized. It's like you have a 30-year master tech next to you on your first day of work.
Right.
And you can be just as effective.
Right. Thank you, Nancy.
I'm an educator by practice, former early childhood teacher, and also taught ELs, or English learners, or multilingual learners, as we like to call them at the U.S. Department of Education. And so I'm not going to say interesting. I'm just going to say something that seems like a high lift sometimes for educators, which are lesson plans. We're seeing a number of teachers inputting their prompts to say, I need a lesson plan on X. And it is providing resources and directing them to places they might not have known before. And just providing that access to the learners that are in their classroom has been quite significant.
And this is something that they'd have to, what were they doing before for lesson plans? Just starting from scratch? Or
Starting from scratch,
There are repositories, though, in like places that they could go to.
Yeah.
What's the difference now?
What's plenty of websites to go to and do that. I mean, for education purposes, if you're not familiar with how this works, it's a very local controlled kind of system where the US government is actually quite limited in the authority of what we can do. We serve as kind of the conduit for finances to get to the state departments of education and then down to the local level in the school districts. And the states are the ones that set the content standards. They're the ones that, some of them talk about which curriculum that districts can use, and then others, it's down to the district level where the district makes that decision. And so it depends on the school district. The district in Texas might have a specific curriculum that they can use that is told to them by the state, and they would start from that and looking at their pacing guide and looking at what they need to teach next week and develop lesson plans off of that and finding supplemental resources. In other states, that's not the case. I taught in Omaha, Nebraska, and we had our standards, we had a series for reading, for English language arts, for math, whatever, but I was going online and finding stuff all the time. And so then that's also that burden, that extra burden on teachers where we're spending so many hours going out and finding these resources to make that a really engaging learning experience for learners.
Great. Andrew, I want to come to you and learn a little bit more about Speak a little bit. It's a language learning app. And you're one of the early partners with OpenAI, and you have pretty good a partnership with kind of their technologies and GPT-4 and some of the latest and the greatest that they're building. What kinds of experiences are like possible or accessible now for language learning that wasn't possibly like with the previous or current versions of Duolingo's, the other market leaders in the space? So tell me a little bit more about what's possible now in this discipline.
Cool. So a little bit of context first, I guess. So Speak is kind of like a conversational partner in your pocket. We are the #1 English app in South Korea, and the entire experience is basically a bunch of interactive lessons where you are learning things and then speaking back, and we use speech recognition and other machine learning techniques to score what you're saying, provide feedback. We'll highlight words in various colors depending on your pronunciation and so on. So it's like an automated speaking buddy, if you will. This was the sort of thing that 10 years ago, even as recently as 5 years ago, you had to hire a human and pay them $50, $60 an hour to do. So with that initial product, what we've seen with all of this generative AI stuff with OpenAI is now we can actually build much more open-ended, spontaneous experiences where you can practice English by practicing ordering a latte and like a donut from a barista, or practicing checking to your hotel. These very open-ended, functional, scenarios, and it's been really amazing, I think, for our users. A lot of the more intermediate, advanced level learners are really loving it. We're seeing huge upticks in basically advanced learners using Speak. Specifically in the past year, or I mean like past 6 months, when GPT-4 started coming out, I don't know how many of you have used ChatGPT, but current ChatGPT is actually a previous version. It's called GPT 3.5 Turbo under the hood. And 3.5 Turbo is able to play the conversational partner. So it can be the barista, and then you can be the person ordering, and that's fine. But what it can't do is provide more advanced grammatical feedback and feedback on, hey, what you said in this context was not very native sounding. It was not very conversational. There's a more colloquial, sort of idiomatic way of saying it. Also, it can't do that in any other languages. So remember that a lot of our learners are not very good at English. They're native Korean speakers. So what GPT-4 can do, which is incredible, is provide this sort of advanced feedback at high quality in any of the top 30 languages. That's like pretty mind-blowing. And this AI tutor product with the role plays that we built was basically the first thing that we built in December when we had early access to GPT-4 as fast as possible. Over the coming year, we're going to start building just like all the other parts of the experience surrounding this that we want to build. There's going to be a lot of stuff around assessing how fluent somebody is at English or Spanish or other languages, understanding like a proficiency graph of what a user has actually learned through their experience with Speak. There's basically a lot of parts now that you needed to hire a human for in the past that are the very sort of rote, repetitive aspects of language learning, like conversational drilling and practice, that can now be done in an app. And that's kind of the future that we're moving toward. We think that we can build an English tutor on your phone that is as good as the best English tutors on earth, and then give that to everyone. So that's kind of, I guess, the accessibility angle. There's just like a huge, huge shortage of really good English tutors. 2 billion people that want to learn English. And we think that something like Speak is going to be the solution over the next few years.
Now, can it be as good as actually living in a foreign country and figuring out how to, talk to the taxi driver to get you to somewhere obscure? Maybe that's the holy grail that will become possible. Every time we talk about AI or any disruptive technology, like the discussion inevitably will kind of touch upon, like how is this going to augment, human capacity? What is it going to replace? Or what should it replace? It's probably not like cool or kosher to talk about technology replacing humans at this conference, but especially given like all the, when I think about the teaching profession and all that we have asked teachers to do, it seems like that load gets heavier and heavier by the year. So want to get your thoughts around like with these current generations of AI tools, like what should we augment, what should we really like replace? And maybe I'll start with Satya with your experience with Merlyn and your AI teaching assistant.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. So yeah, I mean, just a little bit of background, right, before I jump into what we are doing with AI and teachers with Merlyn. So when we were at IBM Research, IBM Watson, we led a project. This was back in the early 2010s. One of the things that happened when kind of Watson won Jeopardy is a smaller version of what happened with ChatGPT, which is we were inundated with a huge amount of demand from all corners of the world, right? I was sitting there in the research division. Jeopardy had just happened, right, literally next door. And so we had people from the finance industry, insurance, healthcare, education, everybody come to us, right? And so one of the greatest jobs I had was I was tasked with doing something with Watson in education. And so there I was sitting in the halls of IBM Research. That's where Kasparov got beaten by Deep Blue, Watson won Jeopardy, a good portion of modern computing got invented, and I felt the pressure to do something really, I would like to say, grand with AI, right, and education. And one of the hallmarks of the field, one of the grand challenges of AI, ever since the whole field started in the 1950s, is can we build a machine that can teach? So we set out to try to build this machine that can teach, right? Can act as a proper tutor, AI tutor. And this is, again, 2010, 2011, 2012, right? And we poured, 8-9 figures of money, like huge amounts of money, hundreds of PhDs at this effort, right, which I led. And at the end of 2017, when I left IBM to found Merlyn, I basically concluded that the effort was a disaster. Okay, yeah. And from that disaster, Merlyn was born, and it's a true story, right? And the reason and kind of the reason it didn't work was nothing to do with technology. It had to do with a deeper understanding of what humans do so well, right? And what do teachers do so well, right? And if there are educators in the audience, you'll resonate with this. So the best teachers effortlessly reach for metaphors, analogies. They share a background understanding of the world. They understand a student's affect. They understand whether the student's ready to learn, where the student comes from. There's so much context. And teaching is such a deeply human process that getting a machine to replace what a teacher will do is well-nigh impossible. It's, in fact, one of the last fields, in my opinion, that will ever be automated, right? So when we started this company, we basically said, okay, given we know this, what is interesting to do with AI in education, right? And so we settled on this thesis that we need to get AI to do what computers do really well, and we need to leave humans to do what humans do really well, right? And this partnership or this augmentation is where all the action will be, right? And so when we studied the teaching profession, for instance, we discovered that teachers spend enormous amounts of time, especially post-COVID, juggling 20 different laptops in the classroom, their own computer, multiple applications. On average, a teacher is using 30 to 40 applications in a work week, right? And they're tethered to the desk because they're constantly trying to switch between tabs and, right? They're skipping to the 2-minute, 30-second mark in a YouTube video, right? And we said, why wouldn't we build an AI assistant to actually do all of this and untether the teacher from the front of the classroom so they can be with their students and do the really human thing of imparting wisdom and motivation and, right, understanding to students, right? And automate all the functions that are holding them back, right? So the Merlyn assistant is powered by generative AI, and I'll talk about generative AI in a minute, right? Is basically a voice assistant that liberates teachers to walk around the classroom, right? They ask questions, they control their computer, control student laptops, right? Show Tony's laptop on the screen, right? Control the front of classroom display, right? That's what we do. We basically take the mundane work away from teaching, right, and automate all of that with voice and AI, right? And now we're powering it with generative AI, with conversational experiences. And instead of hitting GPT-4, we're actually building our own built for education foundation model, right? That's private, that's secure, that's basically meant for, right, that's tuned on content that ensures it's always going to be safe and doesn't hallucinate, which you referenced in your opening remarks, right? So this is the augmentation that we see playing out. So we're in a few thousand classrooms now. We just signed a partnership to be in front of classroom panels in hundreds of thousands of classrooms in the next year or so. Bringing conversational AI, automations, right, that free up teachers and that change the AI classroom experience. And that's kind of what we're doing at Merlyn.
Nancy, so according to you, or your what you see with AI, like nobody really wants to do the sewage line checking work anymore. So maybe that will be replaced. But what are some other ways? As you think about what the future of like skilled blue-collar trades look like what are some ways in which the tools that you're building or technologies you're working with going to make some of these create new kinds of jobs and also help people upskill to be ready to take those kinds of jobs?
Yeah, I strong believe in actually the new generation of workforce actually needs more. They need to be trained and skilled in a much more digitally native, AI native way in order to do some of these things.
Yeah, I hear that America needs more carpenters. That's a big thing right now because all of us, we work in front of computers, we have all these soft skills and I don't know, some of the skill trades, there's a huge demand for this vocational stuff.
Exactly. So I think there is, and a lot of I think the best analogy is everybody know about autonomous driving, right? 10 years ago we said, oh, there's Tesla's going to do autonomous driving, it's still not autonomous, right? Like the person is still, you still need to sit there and tap the steering wheel, but like along the 10-year journey, like there's a bunch of things that are, oh, you want the automated parking and the bigger screen and the lane assist and things like that along the way. It's going to still take quite a while, especially for, I think, blue-collar jobs to completely be, I think human is always in the loop, but the job of the human changes. To give you, I talk about this as, like we're in some ways improving and reinventing jobs for the better. We're turning kind of blue-collar jobs to be more like, I guess I call like baby blue, and eventually probably, it's kind of towards the blue-collar jobs right now are like really hard jobs, right? Really like, these guys out here like doing physical jobs versus like, hey, by the way, for the lake management profession, they're all like bachelor's and master's degrees of environmental studies. 80% of the day, day in the life, what they do is they drive around all the different lakes they're responsible for hours and hours and hours, 80% of the day, to just see if there's a problem. And what they're really trained to do is like, monitoring and looking at the environmental data, how the lake is evolving and changing over time, and be able to determine, okay, I do this thing to help control and make sure the lake is clean. So they really only spend 20% of the time to do what they really are trained for, and 80% of the time doing just driving around like on a golf cart. So that's where AI will really replace, and actually it makes human do what we do best. So really, I think that's kind of how I feel, and and it's the same for like HVAC, right? Like a huge industry, 140 million households in the U.S. with HVACs, like hundreds of thousands of HVAC technicians. The way they're doing it today, it's like, okay, every year I promise I will come to your house to check on it, no matter if there's a problem or not, right? And that's 80% of the time. And then when the 20% time on 4th of July, when you're hosting a party, when your HVAC system is down, you're angry at them, right? Like, where are you, right? Like, why are you not at my house? When all of this, if their jobs are going to shift towards, instead of driving around every day right now, they're like, beginning of the day, like, oh, here's my 4 jobs I need to go to. Okay, I'm just going to drive over there. Instead, I'd be like, okay, they are opening up their computer, looking at the digital dashboard, looking at all the household they're responsible for, and AI is telling them, okay, call this customer because their house is they're impacted in like 2 weeks. So schedule a good time, make sure it's fixed before it breaks down. So it completely changes the dynamics in what they do.
I want to bring the conversation a little bit back to the accessibility side. When we talk about AI or any advanced technologies, there's oftentimes the reality, it's not just a risk, that learners from underprivileged communities or those with disabilities are often left out. Kristina, I know that your office thinks a lot about equity and equitable access to technologies, trying to make sure, narrow the digital divide. How is the office? How's your office kind of thinking about this and like what are some of the levers that you have to try to, make sure that these gaps don't widen?
Yeah, great question. So I think to start with, I would say we're looking at where these data sets are coming from and how we can contribute more education sector specific data to help inform the AI. And so our colleagues at the Institute for Educational Sciences, which is an independent arm as part of the US Department of Education that focuses on research and development, they also run the NAEP test, which is the national test that is a sample of where students are. You may have heard it in the papers in last fall because test scores fell, that kind of stuff. There are over 250,000 students that have taken these tests, and we have really robust data to actually help inform some of these tools. And so we want to make sure that there's more sector-specific data that's being used. That's the first thing. And then we do have to talk about our special populations that have historically been marginalized, underrepresented, undercounted, whatever the case may be, and where we can step in. Right now, one of my team members is focusing on AI, but then another team member is focusing focusing on accessible educational technology. And then we come together and we talk about the intersection of those two things. And so we're in the process of getting ready to host a convening, because we like to host convenings, on June 1st, where we're going to have students with disabilities, parents and caregivers in the room with ed tech developers, because we want them to have that conversation. Whether they're using AI as part of their ed tech tool or not, we have to have that conversation and say, I require a screen reader, and when I use your tool, it doesn't work. Or I need some, whatever the case may be, that we have to have those open conversations with the developers to make sure that they are represented. The same can be said for ELs or for our multilingual learners. Are we being able to provide scaffolding for their English language acquisition? It takes a long time to acquire English if you come to this country. And socially, again, I used to teach these kids, socially, they can quickly jump into conversations within a matter of months. But the academic language acquisition takes up 5 to 7 years. So if I taught kindergarten, which I did, they're still not getting that full language for their content until 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. And so how can we think about the tools that we're using and with the AI that's hopefully embedded in there to help support?
Yeah, I'd love to open it up to maybe the other developers on this. I mean, how can AI kind of help us overcome some of the biases that are embedded within our existing educational systems and our data, and policies? How do you think about that?
So there's, I think, a lot of stuff that is coming, and it's already here around AI-generated lesson plans, content, like the specific things in our app, for example, that we ask people to repeat and say, on a daily basis, right? And I think there's a huge opportunity, for example, to think very critically about exactly how you personalize this sort of lesson plan and curriculum. What are the personalization signals? How do you generate content and role plays and conversations that are diverse and inclusive? And okay, this is a good example actually. When we released our AI tutor product, we have this free chat mode where you can put in the scenario that you want to talk about and what your role is and what the agent's role is, and do a role play. And something unexpected that we saw was that kids in Korea would use this to talk about these extremely obscure topics that the AI knew about, but they couldn't talk about with any of their friends, like some super random K-pop group, for example. And we'd get all sorts of feedback about how amazing this was, and how they had nobody else to talk about it with. So I think there's a lot of stuff like this where we can build these experiences that feel very inclusive and respectful of people's various upbringings, cultural backgrounds, and so on. And I think developers being interested in this, and also having this be sort of more industry-wide, and not just industry-wide, but also connecting with educators, with the government, is going to be a huge and important trend moving forward.
I want to point out the context piece too there. That's super important. I previously worked within the open education community, and we talked a lot about curriculum, instructional materials. We don't do anything like that really at the federal level. But I can tell you again, from a very practitioner-centered kind of experience, we know that the reading series and the math series and our major textbooks are written for 4 states: Texas, Florida, California, and New York. I taught in Omaha, Nebraska. That was not applicable to my students, especially for my students that were ELs that were coming to me from South America and had no previous exposure to skiing, for example, which was always an example in a 2nd grade reading series where there's no background knowledge, there's no schema. And so when we can leverage these tools to customize and localize for that local context, we can make that much more sticky. That learning is stickier when they can see themselves in the materials and in the learning resources that they're using.
Kristina brings a great point. Actually, one of the interesting things about education is it's really about hyperlocal context, right? It's all about information that's relevant to that classroom, to that school, to that state, to those students, right? And if you look at, in fact, I think one of the provocative statements I could make here is, I think ChatGPT at GPT-4 is fantastic, right? But it's not built for education. It's built as a general purpose tool, right? And by itself, it's not safe enough, it's not contextual enough, it's not local enough, right? And you could argue that, yeah, but I can prompt it to do this, I can prompt it to do that, but it's also a huge, heavy, very large model. And then there's this old saying in machine learning that we always used to say, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you train it on all kinds of stuff on the internet, right, it will actually pick up all the biases that exist, right? That on online forums, right? Gender bias and cultural biases and all these kinds of things, right? So I'm going to flip the question that you had a little bit on its head and say, let's talk about toxicity and bias in AI, and let's talk about hyperlocal AI, right? And we need something different, right? It's not ChatGPT. They showed the way, but someone, and we're actually working on it, so that's a preview, but somebody has to build a ground-up foundation model that that's actually safe, bias-free, trained on vetted data, right? But still allows hyperlocal context that Kristina brought out, right?
Is that going to be you? Don't you have a little bit of a head start? Are you going to
we're
open it
hoping
up?
to be one of the people who'll do that. But
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. All the
definitely
spotlight
see
has
there's a
been on
need.
OpenAI and GPT, but I'm curious, like, where are going to be these other models? They're inevitably going to come
Oh,
out.
totally. Look, I mean, one of the great things that's happening that's incredible is the whole thing's being democratized. OpenAI spent over $100 million doing GPT-4. But there is a robust open source community, right? OpenAI itself, they didn't invent the transformer, right? It actually came out of Google Brain. And before that, there's a long history of developments in NLP that led to the transformer. Attention, self-attention, multi-head attention, which is the underlying technology behind transformers, has been a development in the AI community that's gone back over a decade and a half at this point, right? So what's happened recently is there's a whole bunch of very small, very lightweight, models that have come out that are like an order of magnitude smaller than OpenAI's model, but that are a lot denser, right? There's something called Hanson's law, which talks about the size of the model and the amount of training data. And if you have 20x more training data, say a 10 billion parameter model trained on 200 billion tokens or 100 billion words, right, is likely to be just as good as ChatGPT or something that was hypothesized last year. We're now showing that that's true. Our own model has something between 6 to 10 billion parameters, and we can do much of what ChatGPT does, but we're trained on very safe data, and we're using it to power our solutions. In time, we'll open it up, right? So that's how you actually localize it. That's how you remove bias. That's how you remove hallucination. You only generate where necessary. There's a whole bunch of tools, and that's the thrilling development that's happening in AI. People are realizing that ChatGPT kind of showed the way, but Bloomberg built their own GPT model. There'll be education-specific GPT models. There'll be, by the end of the year, it's going to be hundreds of foundation models built by companies like us for purpose, right? And that's kind of the new frontier in the field.
What should AI education look like if assuming that kids and teachers are going to have access to these creative superpowers? Like, what should it look like to ensure that they are building tools to make them accessible to all, but in a responsible manner? If you were to design an AI education curriculum, what's the one thing that it needs to have?
Okay, so you're talking about the curriculum itself?
Yeah, if you were to teach.
I'm thinking about different frameworks that are certainly out in the field already. I know EdSafe AI Alliance, that is a lot of kind of partner organizations here in the US with representation from Europe as well, are talking about the SAFE framework. So we're looking at accountability and we're looking at fairness and ethics and all of that. And yes, we want to use it as educators with the tools that we have in the classroom, but we also need to have that conversation with the students about the tools that they're using, and hopefully that leads to those conversations, especially around ethics. And so like AI, oh gosh, this is terrible, I can't remember. There was another one that just released some stuff at South by Southwest that actually have curriculum and are working on this. So I know that there are a number of of startups and folks that are focusing on this to start those conversations. And again, former early childhood teacher, it has to start in the early years. It's like digital citizenship. It's talking about things that we want them to do from a very early age so that we can have those skills just build upon one another and that they're ready to go out into the workforce and use these tools.
Okay. We got just like less than a minute left, but our final question, a common refrain from you all: let's not replace humans, let's make better jobs. How is AI making your job better? In one sentence, Andrew.
I use ChatGPT to do various things. I used it to prepare for this panel, actually. I use it probably 10 times a day.
Okay. Satya?
Well, I mean, AI has already made my job better. So, finding information's just so much easier now, but it's been easy for the last decade or so with things like Google search and everything else. So, yeah.
Nancy?
I found it helpful for brainstorming.
Yeah.
So it's my brainstorming buddy for ideas. It doesn't necessarily mean, I'm right, just write it for me.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, what do you like? It really helps to have 10 turns of a brainstorm buddy, and then refine the idea.
Kristina?
I'm just going to say the same +1 on that. I've always encouraged students to start with Wikipedia. I know a lot of folks may say, what? Start with Wikipedia because you can see all the citations at the bottom and it leads you to all the other resources. It's the same thing, especially with ChatGPT. I would much rather have something to work from than a blank page.
Yep, and for me, like Andrew, I use ChatGPT to propose some questions for this panel. I'm not going to tell you which one I use. I'll leave that to a mystery. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us for this session. Thank you, Andrew, Satya, Nancy, and Kristina. And yeah, have a great rest of your day.